Roxbury Community College to discuss Peace Officer Standard and Training. And I start by saying Peace Officer Standard and Training because what we're going to hear about today, the issue of decertification of law enforcement officials, is one part of a larger system. And having been in law enforcement as a deputy sheriff for 13 years in Barnstable County prior to being elected to the legislature, I had the opportunity to go around the nation with the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the National Sheriff's Association and do trainings in post states, 44 states, one of which was not Massachusetts. So I couldn't even do the trainings here in my own state because there was no requirement for ongoing credentialing and ongoing CEUs for our law enforcement officials. And so after taking a seat in the legislature in 2011, I was on the Section 22 Commission, which, for those of you that aren't familiar with that, was the commission that looked at the transfer of the 7 county sheriffs to the state system. And we had just come out of a Senate review. Senator Timothy had issued a report on law enforcement training, and it recommended that Massachusetts take the steps necessary to implement a peace officer's standard and training system. The Section 22 Commission in 2012 also recommended that the sheriffs be part of the post system and that we implement it for all law enforcement agencies in the Commonwealth. So at the end of that, in my second term, I introduced a resolve to establish a special commission to look at the actual language of a post bill. And the reason for that is, after only a few short years here, I learned the best way to get a bill passed in the legislature is A, to have legislative appetite for the bill to be passed, but B, to have a broad-based group of stakeholders that are working together to advocate for the passage of the bill. And so if I or a group of small group of colleagues sat in an office and wrote a post bill, we were naturally going to forget something. We were naturally going to have outside opposition to a bill that we would then introduce. And so not only would we be advocating for the bill, but we'd be fighting the opposition. And so the bill, the resolve, we like to call, Representative Holmes and I have reintroduced it in this term, we like to call it the pathway to post. It is the way that we get there. We bring a broad-based group of stakeholders together for the course of the year, and we work out and iron out the details of the legislation, which would include the ability to credential law enforcement officials and to decertify law enforcement officials as well. So the first term, we had union opposition from major police unions, and some opposition from the state police. Chapter 22C powers that are bestowed upon the colonel of the state police are fairly unique among states in Massachusetts, and so the bill didn't come out of committee in the last term. Over the course of the last couple of years, Representative Holmes and I have been able to build coalitions, and the 3 major police unions sat with us and testified in favor of the post legislation in this term, and we made a concession in the resolve to exempt Department of State Police from the Special Commission, and the bill was reported out a little over a week ago from the Joint Committee on Public Safety and Homeland Security. So today we're going to hear some specific details of the certification and decertification process, and Dr. Goldman has been an advocate for decades because of a personal experience that I know he'll share with you today. He has seen this on the front line in his community and has now become an advocate throughout the United States to move this movement forward. And again, 44 states in the Union have a process for certification and decertification of law enforcement officials. Massachusetts not being one of them. We're going to change that soon. So, Rahsaan, am I turning it over to you?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Representative Vieira, not only for welcoming us here, but also for your leadership in this respect in bringing peace officer standards and trainings to Massachusetts. We're very privileged and fortunate to have amongst us the leading national expert on this issue. Professor Roger Goldman has been laboring in this vineyard well over 3 decades and is nationally renowned and brings his expertise. And so I invite you all to listen closely to his explanation of how he got involved with POST and how it is playing out in various jurisdictions throughout the country, and the vision that could be applied here in Massachusetts. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the leadership of Senator Eldridge, Representative Holmes, and the Black and Latino Legislative Caucus for hosting and co-sponsoring, but also being very supportive of this work to bring about this very necessary change to Massachusetts. There is also a broad-based coalition of advocacy groups and organizations, Jamal Crawford and Mass Police Reform, the ACLU of Massachusetts, the New England Area Conference of the NAACP, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice, and several other community organizations have rallied around this cause, National Project for Police Accountability Projects, have rallied around this cause to bring this to fruition. So without further ado, let me introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Roger Goldman, who is the Callis Family Professor of Law Emeritus at St. Louis University School of Law. He's the nation's foremost expert on police licensing and license revocation laws. For more than 3 decades, he has been helping states write and adopt laws that provide for removing the license or certificate of an officer who engages in serious misconduct, such as sexual assault and brutality. When Professor Goldman began to address the problem of unfit police officers moving from one department to another within a state, 15 states were without decertification or revocation laws. Today, only 6 states remain without revocation laws, Massachusetts being one of them. He's now working with individuals in those states to enact such laws to keep bad officers off the streets. Professor Goldman's ultimate goal is to help create federally mandated national database on decertified police officers to prevent them from moving and being employed in different states. I would also note that the foundational principle of the POST system, however, is standards and training. And you'll hear a lot more about that, but let's not lose sight of that as well. So please join me in welcoming Professor Roger Goldman.
Thanks, all of you, for being here today. Let me put this all in context, because it's not, the POST system is not unusual when you think about other professions and occupations in this state. In fact, we just take it for granted that a profession or occupation in which the citizen is dependent on a professional's judgment and expertise, doctors, lawyers, public school teachers, and cosmetologists, and I could spend the whole day listing all the licensed professions in the state. Typically, these regulations involve educational requirements, going to law school, going to cosmetology school, selection standards, good moral character, and then once the person's licensed, the ability to revoke the license after a hearing for serious misconduct. And in fact, it's sort of an oddity that Massachusetts regulates in this way virtually every profession and occupation, but not law enforcement officers. And given their power to arrest, search, and use deadly force, you'd think that they would be the first to be so regulated. The answer is nothing, and here's the reason, it's historic. Historically, we have left this up to sheriffs and chiefs and state police superintendents to do the hiring and firing and selection. And we don't normally think about, there is a role for the state at all. If I were to give you a quiz, you would say, oh no, this is up to the police departments, it's up maybe to the Department of Justice, but the state really doesn't have much of a role. Well, criticism of this situation, of the absence of state licensing and professional standards, surfaced back in the 1920s. There was a commission called the Wickersham Commission, and it noted the lack of any state training standard. In the 1950s, the ABA, American Bar Association, enacted a Model Police Training Act, again focusing on the importance of training. But the first time POST, the idea of a Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, became well discussed was in the Kerner Commission report of 1967. Of course, that was set up after the assassination of Martin Luther King. The report went into a discussion of unequal justice for blacks and whites in this country, and recommended that every state have a POST. Again, the role of the post, like other professionals, commissions, set training and selection standards, give a license exam, require continuing education, and then revoke licenses, or we a lot of times talk about revocation, but the role of the post at the disciplinary end is not just revocation. It can be suspension, probation, whatever, just like you don't have to have your license revoked as a lawyer. There's sanctions short of that. So as you heard Rep. Vieira tell you, there are now 44 states that have such boards. Those boards have decertified 30,000 officers, an approximate estimate, but that's my best guess. And as you know, Massachusetts is not one of those states. Let me tell you the other states that are not post states. California, Hawaii, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. Those states account for over 25% of all officers, law enforcement officers in the country. So when we talk about 30,000 decertifications, if those 6 states had licensing, my guess is at least some of those decertifications. And I know Massachusetts has great officers, but you know there are some bad apples in every state. We would have more than 30,000. The only role of the equivalent agency in Massachusetts, if there isn't a post, is that of the Municipal Police Training Committee, the MPTC. That committee was set up in 1964 for purposes of training police officers, and indeed that's really what it does today. In fact, most states back in the 60s, that's all their state agency did. It did training. But those states, unlike Massachusetts, have expanded to include the need to check selection standards. You know, you're not going to be admitted to the bar if you don't pass character checks, if you're convicted of a felony, convicted of certain misdemeanors. So it's a statewide selection standard. In Massachusetts, the only selection standard is, in order to be appointed, you have to not be convicted of a felony. Now, that's not to say that chiefs and sheriffs aren't going to use other standards, but as far as the state's concerned, that's the only selection standard. Were there to be a post, clearly there would be more than that. Massachusetts, Rep. Vieira mentioned the 2012, 2010, but over the years, since 1996, there have been studies. First recommended, it's called the Scheck study in 1996 that we post. I'm sorry, that was 2006. The Johnson study in 1996. In 2010, there was a final report issued by the legislative created Special Commission on Mass Police Training that made the same recommendation. So this is not a new discussion. What's new is we just haven't had it introduced in the legislature. So it's great news that the first step of getting this resolved out has been taken. Let me turn to what is the role of the MPTC. As I said, it's responsible for training standards, development, delivery, and enforcement of those standards for specified law enforcement officers. This includes mandatory basic training of recruits, and it also includes mandatory training of 40 hours per year, but the problem is there's no reportability or accountability to know if that's actually taking place. If this were a post-state, it would definitely be mandated. You have to make sure that these officers are going through training. In my state, I have to file a report. I've had my 15 hours of CLE training. I'm sure it's for many other professions. So that would be one thing a post would do. Another thing that would happen in a post-state, not all, but many, is a comprehensive competency exam. The equivalent of a bar exam. It isn't enough just to pass law school, right, to graduate, but you also have to take a standardized exam so we have a minimum level of competency. Now, were Massachusetts to become a post-state, there'd be no change in the way the current training regime is operated. The post now and would regulate the curriculum, the instructors. You would still have the academies in existence, the State Police Academy, the Boston Police Academy, and so forth. So the training aspect, the main change would be just to make sure it's enforced and mandatory that you do the annual reporting. Another issue with a limitation with the current MPTC is it only has jurisdiction for this training over 3 types of police. Municipal police, University of Massachusetts, the 5 campuses police, and environmental police. But look what's missing from its jurisdiction. Deputy sheriffs, state police, as Rep. Vieira mentioned, other campus police, special or auxiliary police officers, constables, all of whom have law enforcement power. So the goal would be, whatever the ultimate end of this is, you would want as many of those folks who have the power to arrest, use deadly force, and search to be covered by that post commission. By the way, the one exception in the post states tends to be elected sheriffs who are constitutionally made sheriffs. And so that those folks generally are, most of the sheriffs voluntarily do it, but they aren't forced to be certified. Okay, with respect to selection standards, in order to be certified to be eligible to be an officer, do have selection standards. Florida, for example, can't be convicted of a felony, not have been convicted of a misdemeanor involving perjury, can't be dishonorably discharged from the armed forces, and then a mandatory check, typically by the local agencies, that the folks meet a good moral character. Many state posts require psychological evaluations before you can be certified. As I mentioned, the only selection standard now in Massachusetts is not have been convicted of a felony, but it's actually quite limited. It only says no person shall be appointed as a police officer of a city, town, or district. Notice it says shall not be appointed. What happens if you're appointed and you're a police officer and then you're convicted? The statute says appointed. Now, I don't know Massachusetts law well enough to know, well, it also means once you're an officer, you should lose your license too. I'm just saying that's the current statute. Furthermore, it only addresses you shall not be appointed as a police officer of a city, town, or district. It says nothing about environmental officers or UMass officers. So it's a fairly narrow statute. Okay, now turning to the issue of decertification. What would be the grounds for decertification if this pathway commission got going and it enacted a statute? There's lots of choices to have. The main question is going to be is, should this statute, the post grounds for decertification, be limited to convictions of a felony or certain misdemeanors? Or should it be broader to include decertification for commission of conduct rather than conviction of? Of the 44 states that decertify, 24 are more than just convictions. And if you think about it, my guess is most professions and occupations in this state that are licensed, it isn't just limited to convictions of. Okay, so the MPTC has no power to discipline the officer for misconduct. That's up to the hiring agency. They have the power to hire and fire, typically subject to review maybe by a civil service commission or arbitrator. But the post has no role, or I should say the MPTC has no role. So you might ask, why is there need for another level of bureaucracy like the post? Well, the answer is that merely because an officer has been fired for misconduct and his termination has been upheld by appeal, he's still eligible to be hired by another department. I'm not saying another department would, but he's eligible. In a post state, you're not eligible to do so. So again, there's a big difference between losing your job, that's up to the hiring agency, the sheriff, the chief, and losing your license, that's the role of the post. Rep. Vieira mentioned why I got interested in this 35 topic. And it's because I became convinced that it isn't enough to leave it up to local chiefs and sheriffs to do the right thing. Most will, some won't. So here's my personal story. Back in the early 80s, there was a lieutenant who worked for a fairly large department in St. Louis County. And he had a, odd is not quite word, it's a euphemism, for training his patrolmen how to get confessions. Stick a gun down the suspect's throat, tell him to suck on it, and if he doesn't confess then, phase 2. Handcuff the suspect, play Russian roulette, and pull the trigger. I know it's unbelievable, but this was in the 70s, so it wouldn't happen today. But this actually happened. The patrolman who this lieutenant hired, because I really want to focus on the lieutenant here, his name is Sorbello, He was not in the room when his patrolman did just what he'd done a few weeks earlier, and they pulled the trigger and they killed a mentally challenged suspect who was thought to have tried to cash a $40 stolen traffic. But that's not the story. The story is, after he was fired for this and other misconduct, and the newspapers were writing about it all the time, he was hired by a tiny department out by the airport called Breckenridge Terrace. And they knew what he had done at that first department. But why would he hire him? Let me give you a quote from his justification for why he hired him. He said, "I knew what this fellow had done." This is in the Post-Dispatch. "He was never found guilty of anything. Our policy is that if a man comes to us qualified, we take it from there and make our own judgment." So he's hired, but only one day a week. He has his service revolver from this tiny department. He goes back to the bigger department, the town where he first started working in policing. He was now a salesman, and he sees someone breaking into a car. And I'm an officer. The guy runs. No danger to him. He shoots in the back and kills him. That's when I said to myself, how could we have a system that would allow him to get that second job? But for that, I wouldn't be here today. So that's really my Ferguson story, if you will, how I got so interested in this for 35 years ago. And, still at it, as you can tell. Now, why hire? Why would that second guy hire him? It's not just, oh, he's available. This is a very cash-strapped department. They could not afford a good officer. So first of all, he's discounted. How much is this officer going to get on the open market? He can't work for a good department like St. Louis County. He can only work there. Secondly, if you have an option, you're a financially strapped department, between hiring a new recruit with a good record versus this guy, Sorbello, has his training certificate, his 6 months. Compared to a recruit, you may have to pay for his salary while he's attending training. You pay for training as well. So if you ever hear the quote, "Is the economy stupid?" I mean, really, that's exactly what's going on here. You can get the officer right away. You don't have to wait for 6 months. That was my start in this endeavor. Now let me give you some recent examples of decertification in states that actively decertify. Arizona is a very interesting state because it actually posts, without the names of the officers, the facts of each decertification over the past 10, 15 years. So this is the most recent one. I just pulled 4 out of the most recent report from the Arizona Integrity Bulletin. 4 cases. None of these officers were convicted of felony. Convicted. It was commission of after a hearing. Officer A, while on duty, made inappropriate and highly offensive racially based comments to his co-workers. After they complained, he pressured them to retract their complaints. Officer used excessive force when he pushed a handcuffed subject backwards onto the ground. The video contradicted the police officer's report, showing the subject was walking and not resisting, walking away, not resisting the officers while being escorted to the police vehicle. And this contradiction, showing the officer was lying, prevented the prosecution of this person for the crime. Third, officer assaulted a handcuffed prisoner who was confined in the rear passenger area of a police vehicle and submitted a police report which was false concerning his justification for the use of force. You're going to see the perjury and lying about what happens a big ground for decertification. Fourth, an officer conducted a traffic stop on a woman who was impaired by alcohol. He was inappropriately complimentary and flirtatious with her. He made sexual advances and kissed her, among other sexual actions. He left her with her car and a warning not to drive it. Several hours later, she contacted the department, filed a complaint, and he was dismissed. Now, let me give you an example of a case that I found in Massachusetts and show you how what happens in Massachusetts is different from what happens in Arizona. This is an actual case from Chicopee. I guess it's on the western part of the state. Several years ago, a Chicopee, Massachusetts police officer was fired for sexually harassing a female driver whom he had arrested for driving on a suspended license. She was a licensed social worker. I didn't make this up. This is the case. The Civil Service Commission upheld the firing for the assault, but more for the lying about what happened to him. It's more perjury. Now, Massachusetts doesn't have decertification, so if another police department wanted to hire him, there'd be no problem, because again, only job the Civil Service Commission is to uphold the termination from the department. The officer still has the ability to be a police officer in Massachusetts, took that basic training, and he had been convicted of felonies. Now, this is made up. Let's put the shoe on the other foot. Let's suppose that the officer had been going to the social worker for counseling, and she did to him what he did to her. She would have had her license revoked under one of two, under the visiting statute. That I think two parts of the Massachusetts social work licensing statute would apply. First, she engaged in unprofessional conduct. Second, she engaged in gross misconduct in the practice of his or her profession as a social worker. So it's a good way to think about the differential treatment, the preferential treatment, if you will, for people doing exactly the same act. So let me talk about what I think are the two most important characteristics. Rep. Vieira, this is just my point of view. I'm happy to come back in a few years when we get to that stage. What is necessary for an effective decertification law? I mean, there's a lot of things, but these to me are the two most important. Number one, a post ought to have jurisdiction over all officers with police powers. After all, if you are a municipal police officer, you're involved in serious misconduct, and you get decertified, well, you can then get a job as a deputy sheriff. The deputy sheriffs aren't covered by this decertification. So my view is, if you have the power of arrest, you ought to be covered. I mean, that's the goal. Secondly, what kind of misconduct ought to lead to decertification? It can't be just conviction of felony or certain misdemeanor. All those cases I gave you from Arizona, none of those folks were prosecuted. It was all by, maybe they could have been, but they weren't, and therefore they would have been subject to decertification. And again, my guess is virtually every other professional occupation in Massachusetts is like the social worker statute. The commission of serious misconduct set forth in the statute, not conviction of that conduct. So just to conclude, what keeps me up at night when I think about the situation, not just here but in other parts of the country. By the way, some states have very narrow decertification statutes. They're not allowed. Louisiana has one. They've never decertified it. It's so narrow. It's like only serious felonies. So again, what keeps me up at night is thinking about that there's still these Joseph Sorbellos, that lieutenant from that department, who are still working in law enforcement. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Goldman, for that insightful conversation with us. I realize that I neglected to introduce myself at the outset. My name is Rahsaan. I'm the Director of the Racial Justice Program for the ACLU of Massachusetts. I think Professor Goldman's remarks should be well taken by us. I think one of the things that he said early on is about the MPTC. It is a perfect structure that we have here in Massachusetts. It is the bones and the framework for a post system. We're just a few steps away from having what it is that we need to have to be on par with the rest of the nation and to have a robust post system that makes sure that there is appropriate training, appropriate standards statewide for all officers, all law enforcement officers in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. One of the things that's particularly troubling is that the MPTC, although it does mandate in-service training for officers, there's no way of confirming that that has been done. And so any of you all who are in professions that require a license, many times there are requirements to have CLE credits or continuing education credits. And for police officers, there's similar requirements, but there's no way to confirm who's taken those trainings. And if they have, what trainings have they taken? And there's a lot of new developments in policing. Issues around mental health and de-escalation and restorative justice processes and identifying people who are under substance abuse and understanding implicit bias within policing. These are all trainings that are available, but again, there's no way to know which departments have taken those trainings. This is particularly concerning as an advocate and as a part of the civil rights community, that oftentimes, Professor Goldman can talk more about this, is that the communities that are impacted are overwhelmingly vulnerable communities, the people who are less likely to come forward and make the complaints. So that's why it is ultimately so important to have this type of process in place. The number of decertifications for sexual assault or sexual misconduct are very high. But again, you all may have noticed this in the recent case in Oklahoma, the officer, his name is Daniel Holtzclaw, who was indicted for several sexual assaults. The people that he was taking advantage of early on were poor women of color with sometimes drug abuse history or criminal records, the people less likely to come forward. And I thank you, Professor Goldman, for lifting up the situation here in Massachusetts and Chicopee to say that it's not somewhere else, but it is actually here. There was another incident in Chicopee where an officer was fired because he was engaged in sexual activity with a 16-year-old. That's not rape statutorily according to the statute, but he was terminated. There's nothing in Massachusetts that prevents that officer from going and working in another department. That's a problem. There was an officer in Brockton, a sergeant, who falsely arrested a Cape Verdean man, and in the process of arresting him, made monkey gestures behind him and told him, "Look here, you African jungle buddy, you people are destroying my city." You know, that officer, who was subsequently terminated for his involvement in that, could go work somewhere else. And again, Professor Goldman's point, not that he would, but there's nothing that is prohibiting that. And so these are the concerns. We have the framework, we have the structure, we're almost there. Thank you, Representative Vieira, for pushing this forward and getting us on the path to post. So at this point, I'd like to bring forward for some brief remarks Lisa Thurau, who is the Executive Director of Strategies for Youth, Law Enforcement, Criminal Justice and Youth Strategies Network, to respond to Professor Goldman's remarks.
My name is Lisa Thurau. I'm from Strategies for Youth. Strategies for Youth is an organization that exists to improve police youth interactions, and we do this through policy change and through training of law enforcement. We also train youth through our Juvenile Justice Jeopardy game. We look at state policies, and I have to say Massachusetts is one of the states that is truly missing in action when it comes to regulating law enforcement. I want to tell you that in my 12 years working in interactions with chiefs and law enforcement in Massachusetts and across the country, Massachusetts state leadership does not seem to be where it could be in many states where it has been effective. And so, for instance, when I tell you that in Alabama, it's not unusual for an officer who has killed someone on duty to be placed in a public high school while charges are pending, people say to me, "Oh, that's awful." And I say, well, there's nothing to stop that in Massachusetts, and everyone is shocked. We shouldn't be shocked. Massachusetts has relied on assumptions that it shouldn't rely on anymore. So these are some of the things I'm hearing from chiefs, okay? This is not me. This is what chiefs are telling me. If Rahsaan is arrested in Lynn for domestic violence, we are presuming that the chief of Lynn will call where he's working as a police officer in Boston and tell them there is no obligation legally. It is a courtesy. And I've had chiefs and deputy chiefs in Boston Police Department tell me they have no clue what's going on with their officers because they have to rely on these courtesy calls, and it disturbs them. I have heard repeatedly from chiefs their frustration about how arbitration works in Massachusetts and how it often undermines chiefs' efforts to make sure that a high standard of policing is maintained in their department. Instead, it often undermines their ability to achieve that. And yet, I can tell you that most of the public is clueless, including myself, as to how arbitration works. This is not a public system for most people. Finally, civil service is adequate, but not, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient as it is currently constituted in Massachusetts. Some chiefs will tell you, yes, it helps us decide whether or not to fire, and it gives us the legal basis for doing so, but it isn't always able to keep some officers who really should not be policing out of the field. Now, I just want to be really clear that as harsh as I may be and critical as I may be of officers, I'm equally critical of another, probably more disliked group, lawyers. I wrote the National Juvenile Defender Center standards to ensure the quality of juvenile defense remain high, because I know in all disciplines that without rigorous oversight, without rigorous enforcement and supervision, things don't go as we necessarily would like. I would also like to say that in my efforts to protect youth who have been beaten by police or have been falsely arrested, I have not always seen good faith in the investigations of officers. I've had to escalate certain situations to get true investigations to occur. And this is problematic, obviously, for all the reasons mentioned before, including the fact that not all chiefs want to bring these officers to the attention of civil service. There are political issues with unions that may inhibit that. And all in all, systems of oversight and checks and balances aren't working very well. I want to make the case that there's a strong value for a post in Massachusetts, and I want to begin by noting that in 2016, everyone is concerned about policing in America. I work in Maine, in Lewiston, Maine. I work in San Diego, Salinas, Fresno, Sacramento, Solano counties in California, in Cleveland, Ohio, which is a perfect example of a state that fired an officer and allowed him to go work in Cleveland, where he killed a 12-year-old several months later. Everyone is concerned about what is now being termed procedural justice, and that's got 4 key elements to it, but the 2 that matter the most to Americans today are transparency and proportionality or fairness. And the current systems in Massachusetts are neither transparent nor fully disclosed to people, and people do not feel they have a voice to be heard in them. Procedural justice is a key factor in viewing police departments as legitimate. And right now, to be procedurally just means you're likely to see that the people in your communities trust your law enforcement agency to do the right thing. And we know this because there are outstanding law enforcement agencies throughout Massachusetts which value very strong ties with the community and disclosing information. And we've seen great changes even in the Boston Police Department with disclosure of videos after shootings. Simple things like that go a long way to increasing perceptions of legitimacy. But we also know that in Massachusetts, we highly rely on a completely decentralized system. The state is missing in action. There is no system of centralized oversight. In fact, there is very little system of oversight within many of the decentralized organizations, law enforcement agencies in Massachusetts. In 2010, we conducted a study of 16 law enforcement departments that send police into the public schools. Only one of those 16 departments actually sent a supervisor to check in to see what the school resource officers were doing. There was no system of data collection in most of those schools. There are no systems because there are no imperatives or incentives from the state to create them. We also think that the MPTC is not legally sufficiently authorized to take this role. But like Rahsaan said, it is perfectly situated to take that role. It is led by a really progressive, thoughtful man, Daniel Zivkovich, who wants the best because he's very self-interested. He wants to make sure officers in Massachusetts are the best equipped, that they stand for and represent the highest quality of policing possible. But his hands are tied unless we fully equip that agency to both train and monitor and oversee officers. It's not there yet, and it is not there yet because the legislature has really confined what it can do. We think that right now, things like training, for instance, are a function of the wealth of law enforcement agencies. So in Cambridge, we were able to train 240 police officers on how to police the teen brain. I can't go into Taunton. I can't go into Brockton. They don't have that cash. They don't have that cash. And so what are we going to have now? Justice by geography, quality of policing by wealth? That's not how we do it. And already Massachusetts allocates very little per capita per officer for statewide training. We really can't do two things at once. We can't proclaim a uniform system of justice and then not hold everyone to the same standards. And if we're going to have a uniform system of justice for people who are charged with criminal offenses, we need to do that with officers too. And I recommend the more inclusive model of decertification as well as commission of felony to be the standard here. And I will end by just making 2 points here. The policing of youth is a very complicated matter, and it is the first thing that gets departments in trouble big time right now. Many departments have officers who've never been trained to police youth, and so when they use adult approaches on 6-year-olds, on 10-year-olds, on 15-year-olds, on autistic children, children with severe depression, children with PTSD, you see terrific blowback, and you usually see it in the newspapers. Daniel Zivkovich and I have talked about this. If we properly equip our officers, and if we hold them to a higher standard, we protect policing as a profession. And professions have to accept to be regulated, not just by themselves, but by outsiders. If you want high-quality policing, you need more. And if you want policing that is legitimate, you will go after police chiefs who, in my personal experience, send you death threats, and you don't have to rely on the FBI determining whether or not that is a case that rises to the level of sufficient priority for investigation. My personal belief is when a police officer sends you 100 death threats, they should not be fit for duty. And this was not an officer, this was a chief, but not in Massachusetts because there is no system of oversight. The state is missing in action, and I urge you all to follow the model here and move on this now while the iron is hot and while there's strong sentiment to increase the professionalism of policing. Thank you.
At this point, I'll ask if I can greet Keller from the National Police Accountability Project to make some brief remarks, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A for Professor.
We are supporting this initiative because the post system is really an additional tool in our toolbox to hold police accountable. We know that, and you all know this as well, that criminal convictions of police officers who commit crimes on duty is something that unfortunately happens very seldom. We also know that civil suits against police officers are very, very hard to win. And we also know that internal affairs is in many places biased, pro-police, and doesn't really hold officers accountable. Post decertification, certification and decertification of police officers is an additional tool in our toolbox to make policing more fair, to professionalize policing, and so we, as a national, the National Police Accountability Project, support this effort, and we hope that you all support it as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So at this point, we'd like to acknowledge Representative Russell Holmes. Good to see you here. Who is also a co-sponsor of this legislation. And so as I have thanked Representative Vieira, I also like to thank you for your leadership in this respect.
Previously president of Mass Sheriffs?
Yes. Sheriff Stephen Tompkins made an appearance as well, had to leave, but the president of the Mass Sheriffs Association. So at this point, we have a microphone, so if there are people who have questions of Professor Goldman, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll bring the microphone to you to entertain any of those questions.
This question is actually for the Rep. Rep Vieira, thank you for having this and sponsoring this event. My question is, I noticed that in the redraft that state police aren't included, and I'm wondering what is the strategy to get them included, or when this post language is drafted, would this apply to them as well?
So again, the resolve is a pathway to post. So there will be continued discussions with the colonel and the state police. But in order for the legislation to move at all, the concession that we made was to exempt the state police. Now, the colonel and I have had discussions about the importance of the state police being part of the dialogue, because they do have internally a decertification process, but it doesn't hold weight of other law enforcement agencies within the Commonwealth. So there's some practices internally that we can learn from and expand upon. And so the conversation will continue. But at this point, it was a concession that we had to make in order to make get the bill out of committee.
Any more questions?
Sir. Thank you.
Morning. I really don't have a question per se, but I represent police in 43 states in the country, in the International Brotherhood of Police Officers, including Massachusetts. I was interested to hear the comments passed by some of the speakers here. In Massachusetts, it's somewhat unique in some senses, but one of the things I've found as I've traveled around the country is that Massachusetts has some of the most professional of all police in almost all states. And categories of discipline are common anywhere, no matter where you work. And these examples of discipline in Chicopee, which I happen to represent Chicopee as well, are normal in the sense that this happens across the country. And it's more severely treated here than it is in most places. The officer is terminated from his position. And it's not possible for that officer to get another job in a civil service department in Massachusetts. Civil service, which was the cornerstone of creating a system of protection of the people, not of the police. Civil service was created not for the purpose of protecting employees, it was created to protect the citizens from political interference in civil service positions, mostly in police and fire. So some of the comments that were passed were somewhat in the right direction, but not always. Civil service is a system that Massachusetts has been destroying since Michael Caucus was governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on a periodic basis by defunding the system that oversees police and fire and other public employees. And on a consistent basis, if you go back and analyze the financial aspect of this particular issue, you will see a complete direction turn in protecting the civil service system. Protects the public from the system itself, which is the political system of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. If we created a civil service system that was created as was intended to be, all these issues would have been addressed through that system. Protection of the employee and his rights or her rights as an employee, but most importantly, protecting the citizens of the Commonwealth from an employee who's a bad employee. We, in our union, understand that that right, that protection is necessary, and we don't condone any such activity that is in opposition to what they pledge themselves to do, and that's protect the law and Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Secondly, sheriffs in Massachusetts are not the same as police officers in Massachusetts. The sheriff's department are not the same as they are in Virginia or Kentucky or West Virginia or anywhere else. Sheriff's department, main function in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is correctional. They are correctional officers, basically. They do not patrol streets in most instances. There are some occasions where there has been that happening, but for the most part, it's not a law enforcement on the street activity. It's a law enforcement activity of maintenance of criminal justice. And we had a very unique situation in Massachusetts for many years. It was called the Quinn Bill, which was an educational incentive bill, which provided career incentives for police officers to maintain an educational level up to a master's degree in criminal justice, which was partly funded by the state and partly funded by the cities and towns. The legislature, in their wisdom, sought to remove that and stop funding it. Police training has been a very important issue for the unions of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we've constantly tried to find places where we could get funding to create and increase the police training in Massachusetts. And if you go through the legislative history, you'll see that. But you'll see also a negative response from the legislature on those efforts. Like, for instance, a surcharge on insurance, a portion of which would go to training, which would have created somewhere $35 to $40 million in training opportunities. But because it was a surcharge on insurance, it never happened. We can all guess the reason for that, because it wasn't in the best interest of the insurance people to get that money and put into law enforcement. So there's many directions here, and there's many ways to resolve this, get to these kind of issues. But they're not always, what I didn't care for the comment was police accountability. Because that seems to me to be, what does that mean, accountable? I was a police officer for 30, 40 years in the city of Worcester, which is the second largest city in the Commonwealth and in New England. And for those 34 years, I'm proud to say, I've never had a complaint filed against me by anybody for any kind of conduct that was other than professional. I represent the police officers there, and I think they do a pretty good job considering the circumstances. And the lady dealing with juvenile justice, it's a major problem, not in Massachusetts, but the whole United States of America. Juvenile justice is a terrible thing that's going on, and children are becoming adults at 10 and 11 years old through violence. And there's a lot to do with the home that has to do with that as well. So I don't want to keep on going on, but the facts are, we're happy to work with people on issues, but if we're never involved with the conversation, we're not going to be heading in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you for that remark. I want to acknowledge Senator Jamie Eldridge, who just came in the room, who's co-host for today, and founded on this legislation. Rep. Vieira, you want to speak to the funding?
Sure. I do want to mention a piece about the funding issue. So one of the things that the resolve calls for is to look at identified dedicated revenue sources. And in the successful post states, there are dedicated revenue sources. Now, some are from the surcharge on auto insurance. Others are from other surcharges, court transaction fees, either on the criminal side or the civil side. And so one of the things that if the special commission is put together is to look at the different types of dedicated revenue and how much capacity. And the 2010 report showed that Massachusetts was the lowest in the country for police training. In 2010, we were spending approximately $189 per officer. Okay? So we got the Quinn bill, where individuals have an incentive to go out and take educational opportunities in community colleges or universities and other settings. Then we take what was the Criminal Justice Training Council, which provided state-funded law enforcement training for sheriffs, which have the right to arrest. You're right, most of them stay inside the four walls. Occasionally in New Bedford, we see them patrolling the streets. This is why the 14 sheriffs are in favor of this, because they know their sworn deputy sheriffs have the power to arrest within the common law. But so we've got the Criminal Justice Training Council, and when money got tight, not only did we start to reduce the funding level, but we changed it to the Municipal Police Training Committee. So we shrunk it even more, and we told all of the Commonwealth's deputy sheriffs and correctional officers, you can't have a seat in this class. So we've shrunk, and we've shrunk, and we've shrunk, and now it is time to invest and to find the best broad-based way to raise the revenue and to dedicate it. Because, I'm only 1 of 200, but it's a shame the amount of money that we're putting into investing in police training and law enforcement training in this legislature and in this Commonwealth. We don't see this in the fire service. In the fire service, homeowners pay a surcharge on their home insurance. And we just built a brand new multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art training facility in Springfield for the fire service. We've got the one in Stowe. We've got 6 regional fire academies which get a certain state line item earmark for fire training. But we don't do that for our law enforcement officials. So it's time that we have some parity between these public services and that we invest in the profession. And as I said last night at the forum, that we invest for all of us, because law enforcement officials have I think it's one of the highest calling in a free society. And there are only a few bad apples, as there are in any profession. And so that's why, for me, the leader of this post initiative is the investment in the training and the capacity building and the support. I mean, just look at last night, if anybody watched the news, in my hometown, Falmouth. There was a crash. Anybody see that on the news? It was on all the news. The kids hit the tree and they're on. So now you've got police and fire are at the scene. Right? Police officers first ones. Fire department EMTs come behind them. At the end of that tragic event, there's a statewide network of critical incident stress debriefing in the fire service, which we fund through the state budget in part. And we deal with the issues and the trauma that the firefighters have seen at that scene. And you know what we tell the police officer? 7 at 10 o'clock at night, get back in your car. Your shift doesn't end until 6 or 7 in the morning. Continue to patrol your sector. Now that police officer just dealt with the same trauma that the firefighter dealt with. And so, for me, there's a big issue here of parity to protect the well-being of our officers. Now, that officer that was on that scene dealing with what he saw, let's say he gets called an hour later to a domestic violence call. How is he reacting? So we need to value our public servants in all of these professions and bring parity to the professions and invest in the training, because when we invest in the training, we build the capacity and we better protect the civil liberties of all of our citizens.
Thank you so much. We have one last question and we'll have to wrap it up. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Rep, for that, because that leads into my question. Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Mary Tuitt. I work with Representative Gloria Fox. And so both gentlemen that spoke in front of me kind of leads into the question that I have. With the new commission, creating of this commission and doing the trainings and so on, especially cultural competency and so on, awareness of the differences in diversity in communities. Because coming out of Roxbury, Dorchester area, it would be different than down in the Cape, how the police officers interact with the young people and the adults walking on the street. And no disrespect to the police officers. I have a brother that's a police officer. I have cousins that are police officers. But we do need the training, and we need a way to collect the data on when they're getting the training and what training they're getting. Because there are some of them out there that are not culturally competent. Some of them that don't hear. We know that MCAD is looking at some of the things around the civil service exam for these officers that are getting into the field, right? So with all of that that's going on, when we do pass this legislation, I'm looking at it in a positive way. When it comes to the training that is going to be required for these police officers to take and be able to be on the job and the trauma and so on that they deal with every day, are they going to focus in on the fact that the mental health of that police officer in the long run, from rookie stage to veteran stage? Are they going to look at that? Because years on the job can kind of harden you, you know. So is that something we're looking at also? Because I work on the Hill and live in the neighborhood, but I get questioned and I get police officers that walk up to me and talk to me disrespectfully because I live in Roxbury and Dorchester, you know. So they treat us, women, men, all in a different way. So is that included in this? Do we look at that? You know, in the years on service, you know, and the trauma and all of the stuff that they go through within that time. Are we going to be able to look at that?
So once an actual post-commission is impaneled, so the first is the special commission to draft the legislation to create the structure. The ongoing training opportunities and curriculum development are a function of that. So right now, Dan and NPTC, they develop, matter of fact, Dan, if you don't know, Dan is actually going to become the president of the International Association of Law Enforcement Training Directors. Okay, so he is a leader nationally in the field of police training for their professional organization, and he came from a post state before he came to Massachusetts. So what he's done is he's invested the limited dollars we've given him in the last couple of years to look at a rewrite of the existing curriculum. And so as those curriculums are rewritten, currently it's his committee that are setting directions to him and his staff as to what updates and what new curriculum they're developing. But going forward, that type of curriculum development would be the commission, the post-commission, and they would look at what's the latest and the greatest, and they would work with the International Association and IACP to develop those. And that's the work I used to do. I worked with IACP and NSA on curriculum development around the Citizen Corps Initiative.
Thank you all. Let's give Professor Goldman and Representative Vieira there are information packets that were emailed to the senators and representatives. There's also a fact sheet at the table. So we thank you all for turning out today and for desiring to learn more about this, but we also thank you in advance for your support of making Massachusetts a post state. Thank you.